lunch people. To our panel, my name is Eric Gregory, and as one of the other members of the Princeton faculty on the program, I wanted to join my colleague and friend Peter Singer in welcoming you all to Princeton. Our plan is to follow the format similar to other panels with brief opening remarks by our panelists, each of whom bring a different expertise and approach to our topic. How far does the right of conscientious refusal extend? You'll find more precise questions in the description, questions I think which themselves raise a host of moral, legal, political, professional, and empirical issues, where they're going to have an opportunity for exchange among the panelists and time for audience engagement to clarify the nature of agreements and disagreements and perhaps seek new ways of talking about these issues. Our panelists are Bernard Dickens from the University of Toronto, Christopher Kaiser from Royal Marymount University, Robert Vischer from the University of St. Thomas, and Lori Zoloff from Northwestern University. So without further ado, we're going to proceed in the order listed in the program, and note that we're starting 15 minutes late, and we will go 15 minutes late to accommodate having a full time for interaction, which means we will only have a 15-minute break afterwards, so we're going to really have to stop at 3:15 because the final plenary will be here at 3:30. Okay? So, Professor Dickens.
Thank you. The first point to make is the one that is underwritten in our laws, including our international human rights laws, freedom of conscience. And this is a fundamental human right, a right of individuals. The language of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is very instructive because it identifies rights of individuals to freedom of conscience and religion. And conscience and religion is an important link and contrast because it establishes that religion has no monopoly of conscience. There can be conscience that is based on non-religious grounds. It also means that religion can be held to account for its practices driven by doctrines that may operate in violation of conscience. It doesn't follow then that religion solves the dilemmas of conscience. Indeed, it may be a source of conflicts of conscience and of unconscientious behavior. But the principle itself is important. The right of personal, moral, spiritual integrity. The right to live in accordance with one's values and not to be compelled to compromise or violate one's fundamental principles. And there's a sense in which, although this is an individual human right, it can be pursued collectively. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights speaks about the right to manifest one's conscientious commitments, religious or non-religious, in terms of observance and practice, and that includes in collaboration with others. So we're dealing with something that is quite fundamental. But the language of the International Covenant has a built-in deliberate reservation, in the same way that it explicitly provides for protection of freedom of conscience and religion. It also says that a limit on the exercise of conscience is the conscientious rights of others. That is, there has to be a balance. And it doesn't follow that the rights of the individual necessarily prevail. Individuals must exercise their conscience conscientiously. That is, they must recognize the claims of others to good conscience that they expect for themselves. And if there is a conflict, then there has to be a good faith resolution. The contrast has been drawn, it was drawn yesterday, in addressing human rights between negative rights and positive rights. Negative rights are rights to be left alone. That is, to resist what is sometimes described as the tyranny of the majority. Of course, another expression of the tyranny of the majority is democratic government. And in that sense, these rights against the world may well have to yield to more collective rights. But the negative right to be left alone would, for example, include the rights of individuals to live with a partner they love and to express their love in sexual ways, even if the partner is the same sex as themselves. That is, same-sex unions, whether they are given the social recognition of marriage or not, are the entitlement of individuals, an individual human right. And the fact that others don't approve, the fact that most don't approve, is neither here nor there. That is, if we recognize this individual human right, this right to be left alone, to live one's own life as one wishes. And of course that may include the right of choice regarding reproduction. In contrast to negative rights, and most rights are negative, are so-called positive rights. And we learned yesterday that as part of the Catholic tradition to recognize rights as being positive as well as negative. That's the duty to provide indicated care for those in need. The difficulty with positive rights is that they do require the collaboration of others and perhaps the collaboration of collectivities of people. This, of course, takes us to the question of abortion services. It may be that with technological developments, rights of access to medication abortion, rights of access to abortifacients that may not be dependent on prescription. If individuals want to use those products, they have to be free to do so. And this goes far before the present stage of chemical abortifacients. It includes medicine with herbs. The drug pennyroyal has a long history of being used for the purposes of abortion. I'm from London. Historically, I've lived in Toronto since 1974. But across Westminster Bridge, across Lambeth Bridge, I beg your pardon, is the Lambeth, I pronounce it Herb Garden or Herb Garden, opposite Lambeth Palace, curiously the residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the different herbs that are growing there are shown to have their particular medical properties. And behind the title of the herb pennyroyal is the single word abortifacient. And although this raises some real questions about dosage levels and safety and toxicity, there is a long history of women alone or in the company of others. Much historical herbal medicine was women's medicine. It was driven out by the purge of witches. But a lot of the history of herbal medicine was women's medicine, women treating women, including by controlling fertility. In modern times, of course, abortion requires medical services, and they are discharged by doctors, usually in institutions, hospitals. And legally, doctors and hospitals have a monopoly. That is, there are certain practices that only doctors can undertake, such as surgery, cutting the body. Lay people cannot cut into another person's body, even with that person's agreement, unless they are legally licensed to practice medicine or have alternative license approval. And we now face an abuse of monopoly by doctors and hospitals. A report has just come out just a few weeks ago by the National Health Law Program called Healthcare Refusals, subtitled Undermining Quality Care for Women. And it has many pages of instances and anecdotes of women going for lawful care, being confronted by their healthcare providers, doctors, pharmacists, institutions, anaesthetists, saying, no, I object to that. And of course the individuals are entitled to object on condition that they have given prior notification. That is, if doctors, if institutions publicize by prior information the services they will not undertake, then those seeking those services will go elsewhere. This requires, of course, that there be alternative resources. It also means that those who are the sole providers of healthcare, being asked to render a form of healthcare to which they object, to have an ethical and legal duty to refer their patients to others. And the duty of referral is important. Our hospitals and our doctors are a community resource. We have to take account of the contest, the conflict between what the individual wants and what a collective group of people, perhaps in an institution such as a hospital, want. And there may be a case for saying that the collectivity may well be entitled to prevail. But the institution serves a community, and in a contest, a conflict between what the institution is willing to provide and what the community wants, it's clear that the community must prevail. And we can test this in a scenario that we don't actually have. But in contrast to Catholic hospitals, that may be the sole resource of a community that depends on them, that won't undertake services. Supposing the institution was maintained not by the Catholic Church, but by another Christian denomination, Jehovah's Witnesses, would a community allow a hospital to be the sole resource that would not undertake blood transfusion or the use of blood products? That seems to be going too far. And in that sense, one has to take account of the interests of communities in providing women with access to the services they need. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Francis and others responsible for the invitation to speak here. Today I'm going to be talking about conscience, and in particular one aspect of the debate, which is sometimes called the incompatibility thesis.
I think they're waiting on your mic. They're handling the mic. So he's just keep talking.
Okay. I wanted to talk today about a view that's called the incompatibility
Is your mic
thesis.
on?
Yes, on, I think. Good. Screen? There, is that better?
If you just keep talking.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. I wanted to thank Francis and Peter Singer for the kind invitation, and Charles and the others on the committee for the kind invitation to be here. Today I want to talk about the incompatibility thesis. And incompatibility is this: that anyone who is not willing to provide legally and professionally permitted medical services should choose another profession. The idea would be that if you have a conscientious objection to providing abortion, for instance, then if you can't provide those services, then you just should choose not to be a doctor. There are a number of arguments given for this incompatibility thesis, and I'm going to focus on 5 of them quickly. One is the argument from inefficiency. Secondly, the argument from inequity. Third, that the interest of the patient should trump the interest of the doctor. Fourth, that the argument from duty of the doctor's commitments to the patient's well-being. And finally, a kind of consequentialist argument in favor of women's health. So first, the argument from inefficiency. Patients, if they are denied care, may have to seek other providers, and this wastes their time, energy, and money. And therefore, providers should not be allowed to, and institutions like hospitals should not be allowed to conscientiously refuse. Now, if prior notification is given, then of course this argument doesn't work, because they would know if prior notification was given not to go to those providers. But even if not, this concern about efficiency has to be balanced against other concerns. For instance, personal preference can ground not providing some services. I know when my wife was expecting our second baby, our normal GP told us that he didn't do deliveries. He didn't like to be woken up at 3 in the morning, and Stephanie just told us, I'm sorry, I don't do that. So this was just a personal preference for him. So if a personal preference can ground not providing some service, then how much more should a conscientious objection to a service ground not providing that service? And it's implausible to hold that doctors must provide prior notification of all the services they don't provide. There's a huge list of services that any individual doctor may not either feel qualified to provide or may not want to provide, and it's very absurd to think that the doctor would have to list out every single service that the doctor doesn't provide. Secondly, the argument from inequity. And this argument is this, that some patients, less informed of their entitlements, will fail to receive services they should have received. And this inequity is unjustifiable. Well, in this argument, there's an ambiguous term. When you say something should have been received or someone is entitled to something, this could be understood either legally or ethically. Now, if legally, at least in the United States, this is false. There is no legal duty in the United States of doctors to provide abortions. The Church Amendment protects physicians who conscientiously object to abortion. Now, if morally, we need to distinguish between claim rights on the one hand and privilege rights on the other. So a claim right is the idea, like the right to property, that implies the duties of others not to steal, or the right to live implies the duties of others not to intentionally kill. A privilege right, by contrast, is like the right of free speech. No one else has a duty to facilitate my free speech. There's no duty of others to help me to publish a newspaper or to get me on TV or to get me on radio. So if we understand the right to abortion as a privilege right, then it means that there's no duty not to have an abortion. But also there's no duty of someone else to help you get an abortion. So abortion would be considered like free speech, privilege right. On the other hand, if we understand the right to abortion as a claim right, someone else has a duty to provide the abortion. But that view begs the question. Precisely the issue in question, the issue that we're debating about, is whether or not doctors have duties to perform abortions. So you can't use this as a premise in your argument to argue for the conclusion, therefore doctors need to perform abortions. So that is question begging. The third argument is that the interests of the patient should trump the interests of the doctor. Imagine, for instance, in an epidemic of bird flu or other infectious disease, that a specialist decided she valued her own life more than her duty to treat her patients. Such a set of values would be incompatible with being a doctor. So if doctors can't omit care for patients, even at the risk of their own lives, how much less can they risk treatment for patients simply to protect their moral integrity? So the patients of a doctor, or the interests of the patient should trump the interests of the doctor. I think this argument also fails because it's not the case that the interests of the patient always trump the interests of the doctor. For instance, a patient may have an interest in receiving house calls. It would be much more convenient, save them time and money if the doctor would visit their house. But doctors do not have a duty to put the patient's interest in front of their own in that case. Patients also might have an interest, a financial interest, in receiving free treatments. But again, the interest of the patient does not come before the interest of the doctor in getting paid for this. So this argument rests on a false premise. There's no general duty of doctors to care for patients at the risk of their own lives. Think about, say, someone serving in the military. That person serving in the military as a physician would have no duty to rush onto a battlefield to risk his or her own life in order to save someone who would otherwise die. So it rests on a false premise that the interests of the patient should always trump the interests of the doctor. And finally, it's disputable whether physical harm is, in fact, more important than moral integrity. There's a long tradition of reflection beginning with Socrates that holds that it's better to suffer evil than to do it. So the assumption that the physical well-being of the doctor is of greater value than the moral integrity of the doctor is very questionable. A fourth argument is that the argument from duty is an argument from the duty of the doctor's commitments to patient well-being. And it's true, to be a doctor is to be willing and able to provide appropriate medical interventions that are legal, beneficial, and desired by the patient and part of a just health care system. So if someone refrains from providing abortion, for instance, on this view, that would interfere with the doctor's commitment to the patient's well-being. Now, in response to this argument, again, doctors do not promise, either implicitly or explicitly, to provide all legal and beneficial medical treatments. Podiatrists do not offer heart surgery. Gynecologists don't treat cancer of the lymph. And if beneficial is defined subjectively, then physicians would have to, for instance, amputate healthy limbs. There are some people who their own conception of their own individual well-being would include having limbs amputated, or people who want drugs for their recreational use. Again, some people's self-conception of their well-being would include having morphine for the Saturday night party. It would also include participation in physician-assisted suicide, and also in capital punishment, because there are some cases of capital punishment where the person who is going to be executed wants to be executed. Now, almost everyone recognizes that doctors have no duty to participate in capital punishment. It's incompatible with healing. And for the very same reason, many doctors believe that there's no duty for them to participate in abortion, because it's not an act of healing, it's an act of killing. The final and most common justification given in favor of the incompatibility thesis is that it is justified because it leads to overall greater well-being, in particular for the women seeking controversial reproductive medical services. Now, this consequentialist thesis is difficult to determinatively judge in terms of is it the case or is it not the case, because with all consequentialist arguments, it's difficult to know with certainty the future. But overall, I want to argue that overall well-being may not be served by the incompatibility thesis. Protecting conscience protects the rights of, first of all, religious minorities. It also protects the rights of ethnic minorities who are disproportionately religious. At least in the United States, African Americans are disproportionately evangelical, and Latinos are disproportionately Catholic. So it protects the rights of ethnic minorities to protect conscience. If conscience protections are vacated, what that means is that fewer ethnic minorities will feel that they can enter the medical profession. It also ensures a greater ideological diversity in the medical profession. Professions may have problems retaining and recruiting talented members in certain specialities if they don't find a way to accommodate divergent views. Finally, protecting conscience, even on a consequentialist perspective, may be beneficial because it provides greater access for non-controversial health care for all people. In other words, if you force Catholic doctors, for example, or Catholic physicians into a decision where they have to either perform abortions or continue practicing medicine, for many of them, they will decide not to continue practicing medicine. They will shut down the hospital. They will not practice medicine at all. Now, in the United States, what that would mean is that more than 10% of hospitals would close. So if we care about women's health, reproductive health, excluding abortion, if we care about women's health in general, their health in terms of cancer and other diseases, if we care about health in other aspects, then it seems very, very important not to further burden the healthcare system by shutting down more than 10% of hospitals and then enforcing an untold number of providers out of the healthcare profession. So those are my 5 arguments, and thank you for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.
I admit to having some trepidation about addressing conscience as a conversation embedded in a larger conference devoted to the subject of abortion. Because one of my concerns is that many of our debates about conscience are actually debates about abortion, just dressed up with different language. And my related concern is that if our commitment to conscience only extends to the substantive positions that have come up short in the political debates, The other side, on whatever issue it is, the other side can easily extinguish those conscience claims when they don't share our view about the importance of the underlying substantive issue. So what I'm going to spend just a few minutes doing is trying to connect the liberty of conscience to a broader framework. And you can be the judge of whether I succeed or not. Put simply, if we care about conscience, we have to care about the associations that populate the vast space between the individual and the state. Not because associations possess consciences in some ontological sense, but because associations are essential venues for conscience. Without a meaningful degree of associational autonomy, the right of conscience is considerably weakened. Traditionally, when we have talked about the liberty of conscience, we're talking about conflicts between the individual and the state. For example, conscientious objectors to the draft, or Jehovah's Witness students objecting to having to participate in the Pledge of Allegiance. Increasingly, though, the state's focus has expanded to adjudicating conflicts between the individual and non-state associations. This extends over a whole range of areas, but for our purposes today, I'll focus in particular, for example, on the battle over a pharmacy's obligation to dispense morally objectionable pharmaceuticals, or more broadly, a healthcare provider's obligation to provide services to patients that conflict with the provider's religious or moral commitments. To help us navigate the shift away from the individual versus state paradigm, I think we need to reclaim a dimension of conscience that is discernible from its earliest usage. Conscience is a set of moral truth claims that can be shared with others. The dictates of conscience are defined, articulated, and lived out in relationship with others. Our consciences are shaped externally. Our moral convictions have sources, and our sense of self comes into relief through interaction with others. Conscience, by its very nature, connects a person to something bigger than herself. Not only because we form our moral convictions through interaction with the world around us, but also because we invest those convictions with real-world authorities in ways that are accessible, if not agreeable, to others. This is what I mean by the relational dimension of conscience. Cultivating and maintaining the conditions necessary for these relationships to thrive should be a priority for our society if we are serious about the freedom of conscience. The problem I see is that in several recent episodes, the state has used its legal authority to give the individual customer's conscience a trump over the provider's conscience. Increasingly, state action appears aimed not simply at ensuring access to an essential good or service, but at closing down the marketplace contest over moral claims. On the other side, though, too often, the response of those concerned with the erosion of providers' liberty is to champion the recognition of a blanket right of conscience on their behalf. They ask the law to immunize an individual provider's conscience-driven marketplace not only from state penalty, but from employer reprisal. My concern is that if an individual employee of a provider has the unfettered legal right to make her own decisions about the morally contested goods or services she will provide, it can be more difficult for institutions to create and maintain their own distinct moral identities. So individualized conceptions of conscience, whether offered on the consumer side or the provider side, will not solve the new wave of conscience battles because they overlook the relationships that are key to conscience's long-term flourishing. In my view, the state would more prudently support the liberty of conscience by stepping back from the winner-take-all language of rights talk and allowing providers and consumers to live out their convictions in the marketplace. Assuming that there are pharmacies in the area that are able to provide the morning after pill, for example, the state should leave the provider to answer to the marketplace, not to the state, and allow customers to utilize market power to contest or embrace the moral norms of their choosing. Rather than making all providers morally fungible via state edict, the market allows the flourishing of plural moral norms in the provision of these services. At the same time, if an individual provider cannot find market support for her moral claims, she would not have an absolute right to force other providers to hire her and accommodate her claims of conscience. Providers should have the freedom to create an economically viable agency with a distinct moral identity. They should not have the authority to hinder the cultivation of another agency's conflicting moral identity. I don't mean this to be some recycled libertarian take on the culture wars. The state still has a role. The state's primary role will be to address market failure. One essential safeguard is for individuals to be given the information necessary for their active and knowing participation in the market. If the state allows pharmacies to stake out their own positions on controversial drugs or on pharmacists' obligations regarding those drugs, it would be justified in requiring those positions to be publicized. Access can also be a problem for markets, obviously. In most areas, access to widely relied on pharmaceuticals like contraceptives will not be a problem, as most Americans support their availability, and the market will reflect that. The fact that individuals might have to visit more than one pharmacy does not mean that the market has failed. If moral discourse regarding controversial pharmaceuticals is going to take place, we must discern between market-driven inconvenience and market-driven lack of access. In my view, the latter warrants state intervention, but the former does not. It's important to reorient the broader conversation regarding conscience toward what is at stake. The conscience-driven practices of providers are not less legitimate than the conscience-driven decisions of customers, provided that the goods and services deemed essential by the political community are accessible in the marketplace. The viability of conscience requires us to give providers and like-minded customers an opportunity to live out their ideals. So if Tom Cruise wants to enter the pharmacy business and open a pharmacy that does not dispense highly profitable antidepressant medication, the state should let him. It's one thing for a true believer to try out their views in the marketplace and find that they're incapable of attracting sufficient support to be economically viable. It's quite another thing for the state to foreclose that opportunity in the first place. Now let me acknowledge that our law, in making great strides on behalf of the liberty of conscience over the last century, has done so primarily through the language of individual rights. But our understanding of conscience and our law's embodiment of that understanding must be deepened on several fronts, in my view. First, if we care about an individual's capacity to develop and claim a moral worldview as her own, that is, her moral autonomy, and her ability to live consistently with that worldview, that is, her moral integrity, we must break conscience out of the individual versus state paradigm. Personal autonomy and integrity are also implicated in conflicts between an individual and an association, and the cause of conscience is not always represented by the individual in a conflict with the association, especially where the association is staking out values that run counter to those that predominate in the surrounding community. Second, if we care about individual autonomy and integrity, we must be concerned with conscience prior to the point of conflict. That is, prior to the point where a particular moral claim runs up against a conflicting claim backed by state power. Conscience's outward orientation makes our moral claims uniquely susceptible to interpersonal engagement and influence. If we care about the formation, expression, and living out of conscience, it is important that this relational process be directed by the participants, not by the state or other outside powers. Third and finally, our concern for conscience must derive not simply from our commitment to honor the freedom of individual citizens, but from our belief that individuals are most likely to flourish in a certain type of society, one that is oriented to the common good through the operation of a vibrant marketplace of moral norms and ideals. The embrace of moral pluralism, not only vis-a-vis individuals, but also vis-a-vis the groups to which they commit themselves, is a foundational genius of American society. In my view, the pro-life movement should be less excited about recent success in winning new legislation enshrining employee rights at the potential expense of employer identity, and more excited by the recent rise of small pro-life pharmacies. The former may represent a short-term political victory, but the latter provides fertile ground in which conscience, in its fullest sense, can flourish. Thanks.
Like everyone, I'm glad to be here and glad you're going to have trouble with my microphone. I'm going to move us back to abortion, as asked. We've heard in this debate a long series of abstract thought experiments, but let me move here from fat men in caves, sorry Ruth, or trucks bearing down on crawling babies and try a different methodology. Let me open with some actual American stories. 1. Here's a story of a woman who lives all her life as a Republican, a conservative, especially about social issues, except for one, oddly. Every year she donates a sum, which is for her a considerable one, to Planned Parenthood. And this startles her family, especially her daughter-in-law, who's curious, This is why, the woman finally explains, ducking her head and looking away. When I was a child, she says, my mother disappeared one night, and I never saw her again. My father could not speak about it. All I knew was my 2 little sisters and I were sent off to an orphanage, and it was terrible. One sister, the baby, was taken right away, but my other sister and I were too old. It was the depths of the Depression, and one night I bribed the son of the owner of the place, and I ran away, dressed as a grown-up, and I worked and paid rent and saved enough to get my sister. I was 12. She turns and looks at her daughter-in-law. My mother died from a botched illegal abortion. It was a complete waste of a whole human life. She was poor, an immigrant, and pregnant with her 4th child. She must have thought she could not feed us if she had that baby. It was the end of who I was, she says. One day I was one thing, and the next I was someone else in someone else's life. 2. Here's a story of a woman just turned 30 with 2 young children she is raising alone, working as a nurse. One night she hears the glass break downstairs when she is reading her boys to sleep. And the next moment a young black man, a boy really, is standing in front of her demanding money and stuff, and she has nothing, and she tells him so. He leaves, but he comes back with a knife from her own kitchen and puts it to her throat and beats her and rapes her. And there is more. A month later, she realizes she is pregnant, and she cannot imagine what it would be like to raise that child in this world alone. It is a collision of very bad luck. She thinks about the reality of racism, of scarcity, of work, the structures that limit her choices. And in the midst of this, she comes to understand she will need to have an abortion. She lives in a progressive town, and there's a fund that pays for all her medical care, and people are kind. Years later, she wonders what it would be like to have been raped in a place where abortion was not an option. 3. Here's a story of a woman who is a bioethicist who is confronted with the case of a baby who was born with a severe congenital anomaly, and no one will say for sure if he will ever be able to learn to talk or recognize anything. He cannot even suck, so he's fed with a tube. His parents and his doctors want to withhold nutrition and hydration and allow him to die, and this is, by all norms of American bioethics, defensible and legal. But the woman cannot agree, for such an act, she believes, is morally unacceptable within her faith tradition, which is not the faith of the parents or doctor. She withdraws from the case at some risk to her job. She refers them to a bioethicist from another state who she knows, someone who's written about a case like this. After the treatment is withdrawn, the baby will take a week to die, and the woman will go to his bedside to sit with him as he sleeps, stroking his back. Now, what is true about these stories? What do real stories, as opposed to thought experiments, teach us? Well, the first thing is they're all stories about me, stories that I have never told, in large part because of the way that rage about abortion on both sides can simply consume a life. The first one is a discussion between me and my mother-in-law, and the second is my own story about being raped and left pregnant, one that I've never written about or used in any way, and certainly not academically. In our search for new language and in the spirit of open hearts, I wanted us to remember the complexities and the persons, the way that the most personal of all acts, ending a pregnancy or saying no to your job, can be a tragic necessity, a moment of the most extraordinary vulnerability, a time when communities can so often utterly fail. In thinking about the moral arguments about how to regard conscientious objection, I wanted us to remember the particularized subjects that are the persons who will bear the cost. I know one might argue that there's many stories, and stories are not data points, but these are my stories. The reason I can tell you that I have never used the story about how my smart, bitter, terribly damaged mother-in-law walked through her life lost and silent, or about how I struggled with grief and remorse, relief and redemption after my rape, was that I did not want to be defined by abortion, named as a victim. I went on, had more children and grandchildren, and I got to teach in places with beautiful stone arches. I wanted to be considered an objective, clever moral philosopher, a good scholar of religious ethics, who never asked for anything except respect for my arguments and tricky little analogies. I wanted cool philosophers to know that I am serious and not confessional, not a whiner, but a critical theorist. And so for the next 30 years, I tried not to feel about abortion, but to think about it clearly, as though it had nothing whatever to do with me or my own body. But Francis asked me to say something new, and because I fear the increasing rhetoric of shame and hate, I thought it was time to tell you something quite old. The final case is not about abortion, of course, although the parents told me that they would have had an abortion if they had known about the child beforehand, but it's about my work. It's important for this panel, for it describes a time when I could not proceed in a case in which the law was clear, but where a Jewish religious argument made my participation impossible, perhaps in the same way that many of you think about abortion. It seemed to be a case of unjustified killing, but I understood that while it was my place to argue, it was not my choice to make, and the cost of my objection needed to be borne by me, not my patients. Now, I speak here as someone who's not particularly pro-choice in the liberal theory of complete autonomy, but as a Jew who is bound to follow Jewish law and thus needs choices to be available, and that will not change. Jewish law, of course, allows some abortions for some reasons, but not all, understands pregnancy as a complex, shifting, and unknowable event, which is entirely within the body of a woman, not even spoken of, by the way, until the woman is visibly showing, and has a complex understanding of the relationship between halakha, Jewish law, and the law of the state. The concept of potentiality is not an important category in most cases, for the law regards the thing as it is, not as what it might be or will become. Moral status is highly developmental and, in a sense, cumulative of an entire lifetime. The texts that refer to abortion are oblique and present several different arguments. For the first 40 days, the moral status of the unborn child is understood as mere fluid. At times, the unborn child is just described as a rodef, or a pursuer, and its elimination a necessary death, a choice of self-defense. And in other texts, especially in early pregnancy, it's seen as so deeply intertwined with the woman's body to be as if it is the part of the body. Location matters, but only in this sui generis case. The life of an unborn child is never seen as outweighing the life of a pregnant woman until the moment of birth. And the woman is understood as always having separate moral agency, capable of decisions and consultation. Thus, for Jewish law, abortion is understood as ending a pregnancy which is unbearable, but never as killing or murdering a person. It can be understood as a necessary, always serious, and always tragic choice, but mandated in cases in which mental or physical health of a woman is at stake, meaning that in times and places where the practice was outlawed, religious Jews needed to be the ones breaking the law to enact the laws of our faith, which is a reason for me to support conscientious objection to laws that are life-threatening. For Jewish law, dina de mahuta dina, the law is the law of the land in most ordinary cases, but unjust laws must be protested. Living as a minority in exile is the existential state of the Jew, and the challenge has always been to remain faithful Jews in states that do not necessarily respect or even understand our moral choices. There's a cost to some of the choices, and one that I must be willing to bear. The call to individual moral agency within a larger community of dissenters is the motif of Jewish thought, argument itself being the way that Jewish philosophy proceeds. Argument is the way that Jews think. I hope that these arguments may be of use in the public square, just as Catholic arguments have had a strong claim there. Real stories are hard to tell, but they help us to count the cost of moral action and to remember the stakes. For my generation, abortion was like the draft for Vietnam, a policy made with our bodies, with our lives at stake. And I tell you this to remind you that the common ground is here, not like war, an event for the distant poor. Real stories allow us to say, I understand what it is to need help. I understand what it is to refuse to act and to turn away honestly and say, I cannot help. I think we need to find a way to honor such choices and needs. Religious Christians will not convince religious Jews to change our mind about how to interpret religious law about abortion, or historically will not convince Jews much about anything, and that's not a new problem. So I did say there are several things I think that our panel can agree on, so I'm going to try it out. So it's thumbs up, thumbs down, common ground. One, we do not want states to force people to do acts which they consider murder. We can reference history here, which I will not describe for the sake of time. Thus, we need to defend the right to object. Yes? Yes? Yes. Two, we know that moral status is a religious issue, and that is why we cannot agree about the content of the objection only to its nature or goal or intention for different faith traditions. We will simply not agree on moral status, and that is the entire point of the problem. Yes? Oh. All right, Catholics and Jews. All right. 3, could we agree that there are some occupations that states require and perhaps license that need to be undertaken despite individual objections? Could we agree that there are some occupations that states require and perhaps license that need to be undertaken despite individual objections? Waging war, even if you cannot protect all innocents, delivering health care, even to enemies, putting out fires, even in crack houses, and protecting property, even brothels, all of which involve serious moral decisions and moral actions towards persons who need your help after doing things that may be terrible in your view. States need to have these occupations. States require them, right? Okay. 4.
They'll have more time.
4 more time. I'm just doing the easy stuff, low-hanging fruit. Could we agree that women who seek abortion or Plan B medication need the services of doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, and that such services need to be safe? Part of what makes such services safe is the ability to access them in a timely manner. Just a fact statement, right? You don't want them safe.
No, the first part of the question.
Yeah, I disagree with the need.
Okay. All right, we could say want. Then you're okay? Remove common ground here.
I have to.
All right. You can look at it. You're a tech scholar. All right. Could we agree that if democracies and institutions want a prescription for Plan B to mean something, or if a legal and safe abortion is understood by states to be a part of a women's health services, then that creates a right for such things, then someone, somewhere, has to have a duty to enact the right, even in places where many people have serious moral objections. That's sort of what you were saying, right?
It's a jump from a negative right to a positive right.
Right, but we're talking about the correlative relationship between duties and rights. You can't just put a right out there without somebody having a duty. That was my point.
Well, you might have a right to not have the state restrain you.
But then the duty may need to not, the state has a duty not to restrain.
Right, the state has a duty not to restrain. That doesn't mean a private actor has a duty to...
No, individual, but it's somewhere somebody. If the state creates such a right, if we're going to claim such a right exists, then somebody's got some duty to make it happen, right? You can't just have a right for it.
No, because we have a right to go on television. That means the state has a duty to provide us a TV show.
Well, we're going to make any distinction between that and healthcare.
I think that would be a bigger conversation.
We are on television right now.
I'm trying here. Okay, this one I think I got. For any scholar of religion, the serious arguments of other faiths warrant serious attention. As persons of faith, the fact that my neighbor considers abortion murder is something I understand and I witness to, even if I don't agree with it. We must respect these objections and honor the capacity to object. Okay. 7, we are also witnesses to born children, in particular the 500,000 children in the American foster care system without permanent homes tonight, for they are as much a part of the debate as what some would call unborn children. We who argue about abortion should have a duty towards these children. And 8, could we agree that far more sophisticated science must be developed to create safe and reliable birth control to reduce the need for abortion? Just define. Okay. But that even then there will be pregnancies such as mine that must be ended. Let us understand the world is a tragic world with violence and brokenness and fragility unredeemed, meaning our problem will not, until perhaps the Messianic day, which I actually believe in, disappear until a world of justice is fully known. So what should follow? I don't know. Alternative service for people who claim CO status was long been a solution in times of war. Should alternative service be available here? Colleagues, this is up to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much to each of our panelists. Now is an opportunity for further engagement. So it's open if anybody has a query, comment based on the different remarks.
I'm exhausted after answering all those questions. Just a couple of things from Professor Dickens' presentation that I think I'd be interested in exploring just a bit further. One is trying to figure out what the work that licensing does in our approach to conscience. Because you can view a license as an indication of competence, or you can view a license as an indication of state agency. Right? So we do give a monopoly, but it's not necessarily a monopoly in the sense of the city selling taxi medallions where they're going to cap it at a certain number, and so we view taxi cab drivers as more like a common carrier. just taking it to the field I know best, law, if you pass the bar, if you pass the character and fitness inquiry, you're going to get a law license. They're not capping it. So does the fact that you have that license give you a responsibility to carry out state objectives even if you oppose them? In the law currently, no, you don't. The second part that jumped out at me in your presentation, when you talked about hospitals being a community resource, which I agree with. The complication, though, is that for religious hospitals especially, they're a resource for the political community, but there's another community in the mix. They are the products of a particular community that flow from commitments that are particular to a tradition. And so, yes, they're a resource for the political community, but does that necessarily trump the community they emanate from? And that, I don't have an easy answer to that, but I think it's a harder question than just saying it's a community resource.
Yes, the function of licensing in many regards is a guarantee of competence. The license to practice medicine, to practice law, shows that one has been through a form of training. If there are professional associations involved, then there's also a commitment to a professional code of ethics, as well as to proficiency in the discharge of particular functions, writing contracts, undertaking medical procedures. So this is a form of a quality control. You're right that in certain circumstances, if you are licensing, for example, entertainment sectors or restaurants, then there may be a function of controlling volume, controlling locations, so that there isn't an accumulation of traffic and late night noise. So a variety of different functions can be served, and there are different sorts of licensing. But in regard to licensing to discharge a professional function, this is an assurance of quality and integrity. That is, you are licensed to practice law, not simply because you have met the training requirements, but also, for example, that you are not a convicted felon, that you're not an undischarged bankrupt, and comparable requirements. Hospitals are rather different because hospitals can exist in a variety of different settings. I'm familiar with bigger cities where you've got a number of different hospitals, and those that are known not to undertake certain procedures leave the communities in which they reside. Members of those communities can go to other hospitals. Also, of course, the hospitals that won't undertake procedures can refer patients who need or want those procedures to other hospitals that don't object. The difficulty, and it's being aggravated with hospital closures and mergers, is that a number of communities depend on a single hospital that is under religious management that excludes certain services. And it seems counterintuitive that hospitals and pharmacies exist for the purpose of making services unavailable. And when they induce communities to depend on them for services, then they have a mandate to provide those services. You speak about pro-life pharmacies, pro-life hospitals, and they are fine as long as there are hospitals that will accommodate a wider range of choice to which patients have timely access. But if you have a community dependent on a pharmacy and a woman is in need of emergency contraception and that pharmacy won't make it available, then she is effectively deprived of that service.
Maybe that's a point if you have. Anyone want to intervene on that point?
Just to ask, the points that you've made are largely about the creation of a marketplace, the marketplace justice. The point I'm making is there's some things that might need a realm different from the marketplace, and the two such realms are matters of religious faith and perhaps matters of healthcare don't properly belong in a marketplace with a person considered a consumer. I mean, the language of consumer and provider may not be the right sort of language, at least not common language, because it doesn't acknowledge the extraordinary difference between the events that happen within a person's body. And then there's one other thing, which is what you're pointing out, which is there's a timeliness, there's a time-limited frame. It's not like you have to go out and do research with Consumer Reports and figure out, so where can you go to get, your Plymouth? Right, there's a time limited, especially if you're morally troubled by later abortions or second trimester abortions, a limited amount of time and perhaps a limited amount of resources. So that would mean that you couldn't put someone in this situation. It wouldn't be a fair market at all. It's not at all on the balance. Right?
It might be, it could still be a market. It's just we would define the access question differently.
But something is lost and something is gained when you call this exchange a marketplace exchange. And I just want to pay some attention to that. What's lost and what's gained by
right. There can be a pejorative sense of marketplace exchange, which I'm using the term, so I might not be able to avoid it, but I don't mean it in a pejorative sense. I mean that I'm trying to reorient the conversation away from one side or the other elevating either full access or full individual conscience rights for the provider as the non-negotiable norm that governs this item. And whoever can win the reins of the state legislature, well, then they get that. And saying, let's only get there when we're looking at it through the rubric of access, even for something like where there's timing. It might be, I don't care what the access inquiry looks like as much as focusing on access. So just to make it concrete, in Illinois, when Governor Blagojevich first issued his order about saying he wants, the provision of these contraceptives need to be without delay, without hassle, without lecture, etc. It arose from an incident where a woman was, to my understanding, was denied a pharmaceutical at, I think it was at an Osco in Chicago's Loop, and could have gone directly across the street for the same thing at a Walgreens. Now, to use that as the triggering incident to shut down I mean, if we want to call it pluralism or whatever you want to call it, within the provision of pharmaceuticals, I think that's an unfortunate trigger, because that wasn't about access. That was about ideals being sort of elevated, planted in the ground as a flag between warring armies.
Yeah. If I could just, maybe this is a point of clarification. Yesterday, it seemed like much of the discussion was about perhaps the unique or distinctive aspects of abortion as a moral issue. I was struck by Margaret Little's phrase that perhaps the fetus needs a theory of its own. This topic of conscientious refusal, in your comments, seem to raise or admit certain analogies with similar cases or cases of conscientious refusal, say adoption agencies refusing to place children with same-sex couples. And as a legal discussion, conscientious refusal often sort of covers a broad purview, but in the question that just arose, I guess my question is, do you see abortion as unique, whether it's access to health care or the time issue, or should it be considered under the rubric or analogies with other cases of conscientious refusal? I'm trying to resist turning the debate of conscience into a covert debate about abortion, but just in terms of, say, from a legal perspective, does abortion provide a kind of sui generis case that doesn't omit analogies with our experience of conscientious refusal with regard to other institutions even?
Well, in the law, the Church Amendment legally protects the right to refuse to perform abortions. So at least in the United States, that's a legal right that we have. Now, morally speaking, I think abortion is also different, because even though I've chosen in my own life not to use contraception, I do not want a legal imposition, knowing the world can use contraception or throw people in jail. No, that's not what I want. That's a practice that my wife and I have chosen to do, and if anyone wants to talk to me about it, I'd be happy to share it with you. But I don't think I'm alone in that. I don't know of anyone who wants to sort of legally prohibit use of contraception. But that being said, yeah, in my mind at least, there's a gigantic difference between the two, because in my view, abortion is intentionally killing an innocent human being. and contraception is not doing that. And so because intentionally killing an innocent human being, in my view, is a matter of justice, a very serious matter, I think that there should be greater protections for people who refuse to participate in that than there would be for someone who doesn't want to prescribe contraception or doesn't want to perform some other service, in virtue of the fact that this is the nature of the case.
Just to be clear, my own approach is not to say let's avoid those hard substantive choices, because the framework that I would like to go to, this access-based framework, is only triggered when the political community has made a decision that this good or service is essential for our community. So if we're talking about Botox injections, I don't think there should be an inquiry to whether that's accessible in a reasonable geographic area for every citizen in the United States. I hope the political community doesn't make that decision that that's an essential good or service. For the purposes of my framework, I'm agnostic as to what decisions do trigger that. I have my own personal views of what should or what shouldn't, but I see that as a separate inquiry.
I think it's a sui generis case, because I think that pregnancy is a central act of human existence that creates its own weather on some level. It is, and that's why it's such a big deal. And I'm with Maggie in thinking that we need a theory of discourse around this particular case that might illuminate some of the ways that it's distinctive.
And that migrates into the discussion of conscientious refusal, not just abortion.
I think we could get wide approval on the right for conscientious objection and refusal in many, 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 many cases, right? And for me, for my lives, and in this one too, right? But the truth of the matter is, if you don't want to have a situation in which no one does an action that you think as a whole society is a worthy goal. And one example of that is using just war theory. Right? It's if everybody decided to be a Quaker, right, at the dawn of World War II, that would have created the same sort of problem that you're raising. If we agree that it's a shared goal, then in fact we have to figure out some way that means something, that has some context, otherwise it's a nonsensical discussion to say there's a legal theory of abortion, it's permissible, it's part of healthcare, it's provided, on and on, but no actual persons want to do it. So that's a situation that we find ourselves in some cities, in some states, some regions, and that's a situation that I think creates the problem. So you really are talking about abortion, not about the theory of an individual to say no to what they consider murder, which I think is an important thing we'd all agree on.
So given that situation that can in principle exist, I'm not sure whether it does exist, if you have one hospital in a rural area, it's the only hospital around, but it's a Catholic hospital, would your view be we ought to shut down that hospital because they refuse to perform abortions? Or would you allow the hospital to continue to be what it is, a Catholic hospital, even though it doesn't allow abortions?
I think there are fundamental problems in having whole hospital institutions committed to particular ideologies. The approach, I think, is to have non-discrimination in recruitment of staff members, so that the hospital, whatever its background affiliation, would have a balance between those who would object to undertake certain procedures and those who would make those procedures available. Regarding doctors, regarding anaesthetists, regarding operating room nurses, regarding hospital pharmacists. That is, they would accommodate those who would object to participation, but also recruit those, perhaps sometimes with targeted recruitment, of those who would make services available when others, otherwise on call, would object to deliver them. And in that sense, the hospital would provide the resource compatibly with the conscience of each of its individual members, but the hospital would not have any profession of conscience itself. And of course, in the Catholic tradition regarding abortion, a mortal sin, death of the soul, individuals are entitled to protection if that is the value system they live within. But the hospital, as a legal corporation, has no eternal soul that needs protection.
Yeah, but that argument doesn't work very well, because the hospital is run by human beings, and the human beings do have obligations, and the obligations of the hospital are discharged via those human beings. So every single person that is in the administration, the staff, and in terms of the people working, all do have obligations, and they all do have consciences. So yes, if you say that, it's true, yeah, conscience, I mean, the hospital doesn't have a conscience, sure, but in that sense, the hospital doesn't have obligation either. But hospitals do have obligations in the sense that the people that run them do, and so the people that run them also have obligations, and in my view, an obligation not to intentionally kill the innocent.
That is the case, but the management of the hospital is not participating in killing.
I disagree. The management, if you have a facility that is killing people, as you would agree in World War II, you can say, oh, well, the people who are not actually operating the killing machine, they're just up in the office doing the papers. Well, they aren't really participating. That would be absurd. And after the Second World War, the people in charge were punished more severely than just the underlings who carried out things. I totally reject that idea.
So let me just try to move on this. I'm in this common ground thing, right? So this isn't going well. So there might be another agency, and I'm trying to think of this, because someone somewhere, I believe, does have the duty in the town where the Catholics don't want to do that, right? They just don't want to do it, and as it happens, no one person in that hospital wants to do it. This is actually a real story. In the state of Hawaii, when I used to work as an clinical ethicist in Hawaii, it actually happened there for a while that there weren't that many hospitals in Oahu, and it was difficult to get around, and there weren't that many nurses, and there weren't that many places to get an abortion, and the more it was concentrated, as you said, merged and concentrated, the more 2 or 3 or 4 people had to end up doing it. And then they said, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go do something else. And then the question was it legal to advertise within the system for people to come and do this specific task and be rejected from the applicant pool if they wouldn't agree to assisted abortions? It was a nursing question. It was an interesting, so it didn't have to be even Catholic, it was just a collection of people. And the question was, does the larger institution, in this case it was a Kaiser system, or does a joint commission that accredits the hospital, have some obligation to assure that the health care that the state says is legal is enacted? And that I think is a charge for people who believe in choice and want to have choice and want to do it, then we have a greater obligation, I think, to be the sources of that duty. And there might be some way in which that is, I'm not sure how to do that. I mean, the Lord knows. I'm not sure how one would do that. But I don't think it can be done at the cost of forcing people, such as our colleague here, to do something he considers murder. I think that's a bad bet for societies, and I bet we would agree on that.
Yes.
Also, we're working on is a technical thing of how does a state, or a political institution organize its society so that somebody is the soldier, or someone's the doctor that provides abortion, or someone's the fireman in the neighborhood with the crack houses, or someone's doing this work which we agree abstractly is important, and we have to figure out a way to provide it.
Yes,
I'm sorry, just one, I don't know if it's my obligation or my right, but I'm going to do it. I want to now invite people from the audience to assemble and ask questions. While they're doing that, in 10 seconds, if you want to respond to any of...
Yes, the role of the state in this regard is to have laws for non-discrimination on grounds of religion or conscience in employment, but also to allow institutions to make it a condition of employment that individuals will undertake particular procedures, such as termination of pregnancy, or to work in operating theatres where pregnancies are terminated. And in that sense, there will be the balance between those who object and those who do not object, so that there will always be people available to meet the needs of the community that the institution has induced to rely on it.
Okay, so I'm going to alternate between microphones and remind you that brevity may be where we find common ground, and invite you to ask the first question or comment.
Okay. Hi, my name is Lori Friedman, and I'm curious to hear about what you think of the right of an institution to have a conscience, because in my research with physicians, many of whom I was doing research about abortion care and abortion practice, and I ended up speaking with a number of physicians who took jobs in Catholic hospitals who took them because 1 in 6 hospitals are Catholic, and Catholic hospitals employ everyone and treat everyone. So they took those jobs, but then they were required to practice according to Catholic doctrine, and sometimes ran into situations which were uncomfortable for them because they felt, the woman needed an intervention, for example, in a miscarriage that was proceeding but still had heart tones, and they were prohibited from intervening. What can you say about this? This wasn't the physician's conscience at all. The physician's conscience was saying, oh my goodness, I need to induce labor, but the Catholic Ethics Committee was saying you're not allowed to because you signed this document when you took this job.
Okay. I think maybe we'll collect a couple and then so.
Hello, I'm Michael Scales from Princeton University. My question is for the first speaker. I'm wondering why he simply seems to take it for granted that doctors who regard abortion as identical to murder and have taken an oath to heal and do no harm should simply be required to refer their patients to abortion doctors. Would it not be logical for them to regard that as being complicit in the murder in the same way that I would be complicit in a murder if I referred my friends to the mafia or a hitman?
I'm Liz Chiarello from the University of California, Irvine. And in my research with pharmacists, I think of conscience in the larger context of the grounds upon which professionals make decisions. So providers might be diverse in terms of religious beliefs and political beliefs, but what I think they share is a commitment to a scientific epistemology. So if we take the case of pharmacists refusing to dispense emergency contraception, it's also a case of pharmacists defining a drug as abortion that mainstream medicine is defining as contraception. And so my question is, to what extent should individual providers get to decide what drugs mean, and to what extent should they be held to the medical or professional standards as the NHELP report suggests? And would we accept moral opt-outs around other kinds of issues? So for example, would you support a pediatrician who thinks that immunizations cause autism and therefore doesn't want to provide them? Or a pharmacist who thinks that Ritalin's overprescribed or supports behavioral interventions and therefore conscientiously opts out of providing that? Or should they be held to the standards of their professional community?
Okay, maybe one more and then we'll...
Hi, I'm Melanie Zurich. I'm with the Abortion Access Project, and I'm hoping you can comment on laws that interfere with a doctor's ability to provide abortion care. I'm speaking here of what are commonly referred to as trap laws. These are laws that provide medically unnecessary regulations on abortion providers, mandating things like sink height or hallway width. And whether this qualifies as state interference with conscience for those whose conscience compel them to provide abortion.
Okay. A number of issues that not everyone has to speak to each question, but if anybody wants to begin, Chris.
I guess I'd like to talk about the right of institutions and conscience. As mentioned, an institution per se does not have a conscience. It would be the people that run the institution, the human beings in charge, and those who carry out the various processes that have a conscience. But I think at least that people have a right to free association. They have a right to make groups. They have a right to define their group and understand the norms that govern their group in the ways that they choose. So if a physician chooses to work at a Catholic hospital, and if that physician chooses to sign an agreement that they are not going to perform certain services, well then I don't think it's compatible. I don't think there's a conscience right in that circumstance to then say, well, I don't want to do this. In the same way, if a Catholic went to a Planned Parenthood facility and signed an agreement to perform 20 abortions a day and to do this and that, and then they show up the first day of work and say, well, I can't perform abortions, I'm sorry. Well, okay, but if you're working for Planned Parenthood, that is a certain kind of organization that provides abortions. So if you in conscience think, I can't do that, well then that'd be a bad job for you to try to get. And the same thing would be true of working in a Catholic hospital. If somebody believes that I have a duty to perform abortions, I want to do this, then it's lying if they sign an agreement saying that, yes, I agree to do this. And I think lying and falsely promising things is morally wrong.
Any of the other?
I really believe, I disagree with that. You can sign a document and then when confronted with the reality of a woman in trouble, say, that was a mistake, I didn't understand what I was signing, and here in this situation, my conscience is telling me, hence the term, conscientious objection, that I cannot do this. But then you have to bear I'm going to strongly support CO status, but the CO has to bear the burden of that objection. So then he's got to quit, right? He's got to quit. Because there's a certain incompatibility in doing it. Meanwhile, of course, in the case of abortion, because it's time limited, it leaves the patient abandoned. And there is a problem with abandonment in medicine. I mean, that's one of the core sort of structural issues of medical ethics before there was bioethics, was the non-abandonment promise and the notion of witness. So hence the very old phenomena of referral. And I understand that for religious Catholics, whose view of this I disagree with but I respect, no, you shouldn't. You should try really hard to think through how you're going to provide really elegant healthcare, good elegant healthcare, and what you're going to do when this comes up. I don't think you shouldn't be a doctor. I do think it's problematic on some level if the kind of doctor you want to be is someone that's going to constantly be confronted with. It's like Peter Singer in a butcher shop or something. I mean, there's like, you have to sort of wonder, why aren't you out there curing malaria or something else, where this isn't constantly going to be an issue for you. But if it is, and you're willing to bear the cost of withdrawal and alternate services, I think then it's okay. You can still be a doctor. You can still run a hospital.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So you're saying I could be a doctor in Planned Parenthood? I don't think that really makes sense. In other words, if I really think abortion's wrong, I don't see how I could be a doctor in Planned Parenthood and say, well, my conscience says I can't do, and my job is to perform abortions.
Maybe you were the kind of doctor that really believed in figuring out how contraception and education, because you said you were somewhat interested in that, was really the good thing. And you were going to provide the best possible widespread public health interventions so that people would not be faced with abortions. And when the contraceptives that you had provided elegantly to the poor or to the wealthy and whoever you provided them to, when they failed, you'd say, you have to recuse myself because this piece of the action I can't do. I could see that.
Yeah, no, I can see that, but if the job itself is, you're the assistant abortionist.
No, then you can't. I think that would be an impossible situation.
Yeah. Okay. We can.
And don't answer that ad.
Yeah.
One
No,
that
that's
says,
right. That's right.
Princeton is opening its first butcher shop next week, actually, in fact, so I'll see if Peter Singer takes a position there. There are a couple other issues, the complicity of referral, pharmaceuticals, and then I do want to open things up for more questions.
Well, just 2 points. With regard to accommodation of conscience, you're right that if part of the job is to undertake certain procedures, then one would be expected to undertake those procedures, though there would be accommodation of conscience not to undertake them. But that applies the other way as well. There can be conscientious commitment, conscience to serve the needs of the individual patient, even contrary to directives from the institution. We've had a number of instances of women with ectopic pregnancies where the religious directives are not to intervene until the tube bursts, until there is some other event. That is bad medicine, and doctors may conscientiously intervene at the earliest stage to preserve the health status of the patient, even if the religious directives are contradicted. And that is also an exercise and an accommodation of conscience.
At least in the United States, those cases don't happen. According to the Catholic religious directives that govern Catholic hospitals, I can share with you some research on it. There's lots of discussion in the literature about ethical ways of treating ectopic pregnancies. It's not the case.
Well,
in Catholic hospitals, they have to wait till things burst.
The report, the National Health Law Program, has a number of awful cases of religious directives intervening in conscientious patient care to the serious detriment of patients. Let me deal with the complicity issue, though,
then Rob, and then we'll
because it's taken a recent, very ugly turn. The point was made in the question about referring to abortion doctors. The purpose of referral is not necessarily to perform an abortion, but to consider a spectrum of responses to the patient's condition, of which abortion is one. To give an example, not from the United States, I was some months ago in Uruguay, and one hospital, a public hospital in Montevideo, was the center for referral of abortion cases. And they were very pleased with their figures for 2009, that 42% of the cases referred to them resulted in continuation of the pregnancy. And everyone was happy with that. The referral was not for an abortion, but to consider a range of options. But the ugly turn has come with the recent scandal besetting the Catholic Church, the recent revelation of sex abuse by priests. and there have been records of bishops referring the priests without reform, without training, sometimes without sanction, to other parishes where the abuse was repeated. The bishops referred the priests, who then engaged in further sexual abuse. Does anyone claim that the bishops were complicit in that sex abuse? No one has claimed that, and the church would deny it. So what is complicity is something that requires a revelation in light of other instances of referral. It's regrettable that one has to draw this analogy, but the argument that there is complicity in what one refers to has taken another form.
Briefly, and then I do want, time is running short and there's other people, so.
If the bishops had referred the priest to another parish for the purpose of them to continue their sexual abuse, then I would say yes, they clearly are complicit. Just two questions that were asked, and I'll be very short and probably totally unsatisfactory. One is the laws that might preclude a doctor from following their conscience and their ability to perform abortions. Well, the fact that the law might make more difficult my desire to act on my conscience is not in itself an invalidation of the law. I mean, my conscience might tell me in a particular scenario I would like to perform brain surgery, but thankfully the law is not going to empower me to act on my conscience. In certain circumstances, it might be a reason to think it's a bad law, but it's the beginning of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. The second thing, which I thought was just a great question about the standards of knowledge in the medical community as defining the scope of the right to conscience. I'm uncomfortable with it because even on the question of whether something's an abortifacient, I don't think there's certainly a medical dimension to that, but even within a religious community, I think there'll be disagreement over whether pre-implantation, post-implantation amounts to an abortifacient. And I'm very uncomfortable with the state getting in to referee those disputes. So I would not be comfortable having the medical community define the scope of conscientious objection.
Okay, let's assemble. This time I'll start on my left.
My question is for Professor Fisher, just about your framework that you've set up in terms of the difference between right of access and maybe the duty to provide. I like the framework and I like the marketplace idea and subjecting the right of conscience and other things to the marketplace. But how does that work in terms of healthcare when, like from my own country, which is Canada, where there is no marketplace for healthcare? Can the framework still work? Can we still protect freedom of conscience? And many countries are similar in this case. So,
thank you.
Hi, my name is Brian Dixon. First, let me just say I share a deep skepticism of when the government attempts to force people to act in contravention of their consciences, but at the same time, society seems to have come to a very strong consensus where we've decided it's okay to limit the exercise of conscience in the public sphere. For example, a boss can't fire or refuse to hire a pregnant woman because he feels strongly that a mother belongs at home. A hotelier or innkeeper who may be opposed to interracial marriage can't refuse to provide a room to such a couple. We've decided that those exercises of consciences are unjustified. Shouldn't the needs of people seeking health care fall into that same category where their needs take precedence over the conscience of the provider?
Okay, yes.
Louise Melling, ACLU. First of all, Professor Zoll, thank you for your courage in saying something new. My question is very much like Brian's, a variation. In the civil rights laws in the 60s, we said that even in the face of a religious objection, a person had to open their restaurant and serve people of different races and had to open a building and house and rent to people of different races, even over sincerely held religious faith. And we did that even if there was another apartment building or another restaurant down the street. We didn't look to the market to solve that problem. So I'm curious how the question is, what do your theories of conscientious objection say about that?
John Barry, Columbia Law School. My question is also for Professor Fisher about, in his discussion of access and the marketplace of ideas, that whole framework, he seemed to make an exception or reserve a possible exception for markets that are very small, where there's only one provider in town. I'd be interested to hear what he thinks ought to be the case in those situations.
I'm Sharon Long, an addition of Feminists for Life. I'm with the National Association of Pro-Life Nurses. I'd like to follow up with the complicity question. We talked yesterday that everybody feels we have an obligation to save a drowning a toddler who's drowning in a puddle. As a nurse, I'm free not to transcribe a doctor's abortion order or arrange for an abortion appointment or participate in an abortion. But if I were to rip up that order or delete that order from the computer, I would be fired, and I run serious risk of my license being suspended. Where is complicity with regard to the conscience question, not only with referral, but just stepping aside to let somebody else do it? Isn't that also a violation of conscience if a person believes that a fetus is a person?
If you can ask your question in 15 seconds, you get to ask it. If not, you can't ask it. Sorry to violate your conscience, but...
Hi, my name is Casper, a pharmacist. Can the panel provide clarification over the prior notification? Whether this is a concept that has been suggested, or is this a requirement that has been made law? And also, if so, then which parts of the US or Canada are we talking about?
Okay.
Same.
15 seconds.
Carolyn Westhoff, I'm a gynecologist. I am sometimes not able to recognize some of the discussion, but I guess what I want to introduce here in this idealization of the fluid marketplace solving all these problems is New York City might be relatively one of the easiest places in America to be able to access an abortion. And in fact, the whole referral mechanism ultimately results in lots of delays for patients, and so in the gradualist view, it's a later abortion with different moral status, and it's certainly a medically more complicated and dangerous abortion. So I disagree with the fluid marketplace and would like to hear about it.
Michelle Kinsey Bruns, unaffiliated. I wanted to ask about what about a parent's right to refuse childhood vaccinations? The harm done in that is potentially not to a parent's own born child, but to many other born children, and some have died in this latest fad of anti-vaccination paranoia. So my question is, I don't think there's any state enforcement of a child's negative right not to be infected with a potentially fatal contagious disease. Should there be? I lean toward yes, but I'd like to hear from you all.
Okay, and I just remind, we only have 5 minutes, so there's a number of questions about markets, other questions about conscience complicity. So
I'll just be very quick with the questions that were directed specifically to me. When there's not a marketplace, not a functioning marketplace, does it change? Yes. So for example, there was a well-known case in California where fertility specialists were not going to provide the full services to a same-sex couple. Right? My initial take on that was, well, yeah, that's perfectly within their rights. They can go somewhere else. It then came to my attention that under the insurance coverage, that was their only option. Does that change my view of the case? Yes, it does. There's no marketplace. There's no other access. It does change it. In terms of race and the Civil Rights Act, this is where I might lose the few people left on my bandwagon, but this is my take on it. I don't think the Civil Rights Act is a good template for most of the disputes we face in our society today. And I'd be happy to talk to people afterwards about why I think so. The Jim Crow South was hardwired for the subjugation and exclusion of African Americans. You could not just pick little access points to try to remedy that. You really needed to transform the whole society legally. I think it was justified. I don't think that sort of hammer approach from the state is justified in most of these disputes we talk about today. Second, if there's only one provider in a given area, does my approach put a heavier burden on the rural provider, for example? Yes.
Thank you. Any of the other topics or issues?
Well, to come back to the complicity issue, there must be accommodation of conscience, but when a community depends on an individual or an institution to provide services, that accommodation must be relatively limited. There's the case that many will know of Rodriguez against the city of Chicago of a police officer whose function was to protect an abortion clinic against protesters. His sympathies were with the protesters. He was given options, but eventually said that requiring him to give that protection violated his conscience. The case went to the Circuit Court of Appeal, and the Chief Justice, Posner, said that it damages the integrity of the public service if police officers can pick and choose whom they will protect. The limit with regard to abortion is the protection against direct participation. That is the surgeon conducting the procedure, the anaesthetist, the operating nurses can be accommodated, but not others. Because they are not directly involved and they have functions of a broader nature. So the individuals will be adequately protected of their conscience, but this is not to be seen expansively. And of course, in a certain sense, we limit complicity where we want, in that we live in societies that accommodate lawful abortion, and in Canada will fund it. We're all complicit. We're also complicit in the public funding of a variety of services that individually we oppose. So the concept of complicity has to be narrowly accommodated.
Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be complicit with ending or not ending. Okay. So if we have 15 seconds, or if you have any final comments, our other two panelists who haven't had a chance to.
I guess one last thing I'd like to say is I find it rather implausible that abortion is hard to find in the United States when we have over 1.2 million abortions every year. It's one of the most common procedures, medical procedures in the United States. So I find it very implausible to think, oh, people can't get abortions. They're getting millions all the time.
So 15 seconds, there's whole states and whole counties where it's extraordinarily difficult, and that's just a data point. So secondly, I'm very respectful of the Catholic argument against abortion. I want Catholics and other Christians to be very respectful of the Jewish argument that mandates certain kinds of abortions, and take seriously when I say to you that the moral status is a deeply held, important religious principle that mandates the ability to choose as part of Jewish religious tradition. And I say that as an Orthodox Jew. So I want this, you remember that whenever we make a religious argument, there's a lot of religions in America. And that's at the basis of conscientious objection. It has been since the Revolutionary War, when people had to figure out what to do about Quakers who didn't want to fight with Washington but still wanted a country. And so it's a long-standing American argument. The argument about moral status, one of the oldest arguments, and this is why civil rights may still, yes, be an important marker for how we talk about this, but a long-standing argument about being able to have a conscience that says no. We're a country that enshrines that and has to honor it. But it comes, those of you who want to say no, at enormous personal cost, and it should. To say no against state consensus should enact a cost, and we take it seriously. And that's why we protect it, because we want, as an Enlightenment principle and as a religious principle, we want the voice of the individual to be able to be heard, no matter how unpopular that voice is.
Well, on that, I want to invite all of you to give a thumbs up to our panelists. But you don't have to. You can refuse.
I want to ask you to be complicit with me in the task. We want to start the next session at 3:30. We want to honor our end time of 5:30. So you have a short break. Please enjoy it. But would you also help